Did you know that we can share time and space with Jesus today in a relationship? We can take seriously his promise to live among us and be present with us, even when there are just 2 or 3 people, as he said in Matthew 18. We can also take seriously that in Matthew 28:7, we read that Jesus is risen from the dead and is going ahead of you. He said this to the first century disciples. There you will see him. And there they did, on a beach, cooking breakfast for them after the resurrection. And they didn't recognize him at first. Only after the miracle and only after eating the breakfast did they recognize who it was. As I said with the kids, it's great to be able to acknowledge that Jesus is alive and active in the world, but sometimes we have difficulty recognizing him alive and at work in the world. I love this story about Karl Barth, who was a prominent theologian from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. He was riding a streetcar in his hometown of Basel, Switzerland, and he sat down next to a tourist, and the two of them started to talk. Barth asked, Are you new to the city? Yes, said the tourist. Is there anything you'd like to see in the city? Inquired Karl. Yes, said the tourist. I would like to meet the famous Swiss theologian Karl Barth. Do you know him? Barth answered, As a matter of fact, I do know him. I give him a shave every morning. The tourist got off the streetcar at the next stop, quite delighted with himself. He went back to his hotel and told everyone, I met Karl Barth's barber today. We sit next to Christ all the time and yet fail to see that it's really Jesus himself. The first step of discipleship, call yourself a newbie, is when you can take Jesus seriously, that he's alive and active in the world. That's the first revolutionary notion that can change your life. Awakening each other to the God who's already there. We're going to look at the second concept, and that is that followers of Jesus know Jesus well enough to recognize where he is alive and moving in our day. We'll call that our second step of discipleship, and we'll call it recognition. Once we know that Jesus is alive and active, we have to be able to recognize Jesus and where he is alive and active. Recognition. If you can recognize where Jesus is alive and active in your world and in our day, call yourself a nodder. You move beyond the newbie phase to the nodder phase. You know, a nodder, that's N-O-D-D-E-R, nods and says, yep, that was Jesus. You can recognize, yep, that was Jesus. That person knows that God is always out in front of us, ahead of us, in front of our eyes and nose and ears and mouth and hands. We see from the Gospels that Jesus won't sit still, that he's always on the move, and that his disciples were always catching up to where he was and what he was thinking and what he was trying to do. Why do you think Jesus' invitation is, follow me? He's always out there ahead of us. We need to be able to recognize where and get in step and follow. As I said to the kids, we have trouble recognizing where Jesus is alive and active in our lives and in the world around us. I'd like to give us 10 reasons why we miss Jesus' sightings. And we're not alone. If you read the Gospels carefully, you realize that the disciples had a tough time recognizing Christ And in John 21, so just as Beth read, they didn't recognize him at first either. Before the resurrection and even sometimes afterwards, whether he was walking on water, whether he was eating by the seashore in John 21, whether he was walking on the highway to Emmaus, whether he was working in the garden, whether it was behind closed doors, the disciples had difficulty recognizing Jesus, especially after the resurrection. We do too, in the 21st century, like they did in the first century. 10 reasons, the top 10 reasons for missed Jesus sightings. We're too close. Reason number one, we all have had the experience of searching for something. Maybe you remember as a kid, your mom or your dad sent you off to look for something. And maybe it was in your room, and your room was a mess, and you couldn't find it. Or whatever reason, we've all had the experience of searching for something, and then somebody else comes along, does a quick survey of where you've been looking, and they walk right over to it. And their response is what? If it had been any closer, it would have bitten you, right? We get too close to the situation, and we can't always see Jesus. Secondly, I think there's a false division between the sacred and the secular in our lives today. We may be open to seeing God in church. We may be open to seeing Jesus when we read Scripture. We may be open to seeing God through a spiritual friend. We may be open to seeing God in nature. But we don't expect to see God at home, or at work, or in school, or in our everyday situations. We somehow have compartmentalized when we might see God and when we might not. And for the most part, it's a pretty small compartment when we might be able to see Jesus alive and active in the world, as if there were compartments of sacred and secular. Friends, there is only one life, only one compartment, and Jesus is alive and active in all of it.